And I just want to give sort of a brief overview of the size and shape of Wisconsin agricultural economy and its contribution to the Wisconsin economy more broadly.
Can you hear him?
Good. And so to do this, I'm going to give an overview of a report that Dr. Steve Deller and I pulled together and published earlier. That's updating the contribution of agriculture to the Wisconsin economy. And so if you've been around the ag industry for the last few decades, you know that Dr. Deller puts out these reports every 5 years to give sort of an update of the situation and understand the trends of where our industry is going. And more broadly, how agriculture contributes to our local economy and our state economy generally. And so this report is available online. I'm not going to go into every detail of it today, but generally what it looks like is a 40-page detailed overview report, which is the main report. And then there is a summary as well. And then for the key industries in the state, we have a 2-page fact sheet. And so if you're working in beef, you can go and grab some of those numbers that we're going to be talking about today specifically for the beef industry. I'll put up a QR code. There's going to be another QR code at the end if you're looking at this report more broadly. So very generally, I want to start with some trends and some historical perspective on where we find ourselves today and how we're going to talk about this conversation for agriculture's contribution to the economy. And so what we're going to do is we're going to break this down into farm and food processing sectors. And we primarily do that because over the last 50 to 60 years, the dynamics of those industries have been very different. What we've seen is a growth very generally in the food processing sector in Wisconsin, whereas a decline in the on-farm to GDP. And so this chart just displays the black line is overall all industries gross domestic product. The blue line is GDP of food processing, and the on-farm is the red line. And so there's a lot of volatility in the on-farm sector, and other than a few years in 2021 and 2022, we've seen generally a decline in on-farm contribution to GDP. Looking more specifically at food processing and comparing that to the rest of the U.S., what we see is that growth in food processing in Wisconsin growing relatively more than the rest of the U.S. food processing sector, and especially more than our neighboring states in the Great Lakes region. And along with that has come growth in employment employed in food processing. And so what we've had and where we find ourselves today is this sort of divergence between food processing and on-farm contribution in terms of what makes up the agriculture industry and who's employed by the agriculture industry. Okay, and so the first stage of this analysis that we're going to do is we're going to look at economic clusters, and by our measurement of a location quotient. And what this measures is Wisconsin's relative advantage in producing and in that industry relative to the rest of the United States. And so if an industry finds itself in the upper right-hand quadrant, that means that it is a relative advantage to the States, and it is growing from that point in 2001. If it's in the upper left-hand quadrant, it is not considered a strength of Wisconsin, but it has grown in the last 20 years. In the bottom left-hand corner, it's a weakness and it's declining, and in the bottom, it is a strength, but it's a decline, and so maybe it's a potential threat to Wisconsin losing that advantage in the future. And so just very briefly, what we can take a look at, and probably unsurprising to a lot of us, is that we see that dairy, for on-farm production, Wisconsin is relatively advantaged in dairy. It's not surprising to any of us, but that gives us some quantitative measures as to how much an advantage Wisconsin is in dairy. And so that number is about 7.5, meaning that Wisconsin is about 7.5 times more, has a 7.5 times larger dairy industry than the U.S. average. Some surprising things, at least surprising to me as a newcomer to Wisconsin, that fur-bearing animals is one of Wisconsin's best advantages. It's not a large industry, which is indicated by that small circle, but we dominate fur-bearing animals in Wisconsin. And you see then a lot of other industries, which include are slight advantages in Wisconsin, but there hasn't been a lot of movement in the last 20 years in terms of on-farm production. And then looking at the food processing side of this, sort of correspondingly, we see a large strength in the dairy processing sector. And so, again, those work in a symbiotic relationship where they support each other. And that's, I think, a really important thing to take away. The one thing other thing I'll highlight on this is we see a decline in the last 20 years in fruit and vegetable canning and processing. This has been a trend within that industry for a while, and I think this gives substance to that it is a strength in Wisconsin, but we've seen a decline in the last 20 years as a result of some changes in the demand side of things. And so this would be considered a potential threat if we're going to use that terminology again at Wisconsin losing that advantage this time around. Next stage of this is we're going to actually then look at the contribution analysis. And I want to talk about very briefly as to how we get some of these numbers. And so for illustration purposes, let's say we take a cheese processor, a dairy processor that makes cheese, and they employ 4 people in our economy. So to look at the direct effect is how much sales does that company generate. And so that's what we're going to call the direct effect. And they employ 4 people, and that's the direct effect of unemployment. But that cheesemaker also supports other sectors of the economy by purchasing inputs, and in this case, primarily milk. That as an indirect effect, those 2 inputs and the processing working in sort of this symbiotic relationship, and that dairy employs 3 people, let's say. There is also an induced effect, is that those 4 people that work for that cheesemaker are going to go and spend money in our local grocery hospitals, on our energy, and so those individuals living in our local communities support other industries in that community as well. And so when we talk about the contribution of agriculture, we're taking that direct effect plus the indirect effect and adding it to that induced effect. And so that's where we these numbers, just to give you an idea. We also know that these industries are paying taxes and are contributing to government revenue, which can go then to support revenue, infrastructure, and other government programs, right? So these industries are integrated into our communities, and this is a way we can measure that as a whole. So the big highlight number that you're going to see oftentimes cited from this report is that Wisconsin agriculture, according to the 2022 numbers that we've done this with, is a $116 billion industry. That's an 11% increase from the last time that this report was completed in 2019. I've seen growth in terms of overall industrial revenues, and it employs 350,000 people in the state, which is a decline, though, from those 2017 numbers. So we've seen growth in revenues, but a decline in terms of employment. From the dairy perspective, we also break that out into dairy. We find that dairy in total contributes to about $53 billion in industrial revenues and employs 120,000 folks in the state. In terms of percentage, that equates to that agriculture is about 14% of the overall Wisconsin economy. About 1 in every 10 or 1 in every 11 people, and about 9.5% of Wisconsin's workforce are employed in agriculture to some extent. In terms of industrial revenues, agriculture contributes about $8 billion annually in revenues in $5 billion of that goes to federal, 1.7 goes to the state government, and about $1 billion goes to local governments. And it's broken down again for dairy specifically as well. Now, the really interesting thing about this, actually, for me coming at this as a newcomer for the first time, is where this industry is happening. Perhaps unsurprisingly, on the left-hand figure, you'll see the on-farm portion of agricultural's contributions, which is really sort of centered in sort of that southern half of the state, south central part, and then maybe east central is aligning with where a lot of our farms are located in the state. But what was more surprising, and when we look at the right-hand figure, is where those food processing dollars come from. It comes from our urban counties. It comes from Green Bay, it comes from Milwaukee, and it comes from Dane County. And so that's just to say that when we do this every time around, we think of agriculture as located in our rural areas, but the urban counties do play a big part in supporting the industry as a whole. And then the last piece of this is that we did something new this time around, was to understand what agriculture's contribution to the environment is, and specifically counting greenhouse gas emissions and phosphorus releases to water, and how much water is actually used, particularly from our irrigated agriculture in the state. And so the number that we have, and I'll just highlight greenhouse gas emissions in particular, is that there's agriculture contributes about 17.8 million metric tons of CO2 emissions equivalent, which correspondingly is about 14% of the state economy. So if you think back to what the economic contributions were of the state, and we compare that to what the environmental contributions are, they're right in line with each other. And if we break that down, that all agriculture, into which industries are contributing the most within agriculture, it's beef farming and dairy. So that's just to say that the economic and environmental contributions are really correlated with one another, just based on the size of it. So we'll wrap up today and just say that to provide some of those highlight numbers, that Wisconsin agriculture is 160 industry, employing 9.5% of the state. We've seen this continued divergence between on-farm and the food processing sector in terms of what makes up agriculture. Food processing is continuing to grow, and that's a national trend, but it seems to be more so happening here in Wisconsin. Thinking about those numbers for environmental contributions, this is a baseline, the first time that we've done this. Hopefully when we revisit this again, we can understand some more of what the trends and changes are over time.